According to the old myths, humans were born with iron in their blood and fire in their lungs. The commander had always dismissed it as mere propaganda. That was until the bunker door blew inward, revealing a man named Cole. After spitting out a chipped tooth and picking up a broken pipe, he proceeded to prove the legends absolutely true. The air in the bunker tasted like stale copper and unwashed bodies. The squad had been underground for 4 days, buried beneath the pulverized remains of a terraforming colony, the map designated as Sector 4. Her people called it a tomb. The commander sat with her back, pressed against the weeping synthcrete wall. Condensation trickled down the collar of her armor, pooling in the grooves of her neck scales. It was cold, a damp, pervasive cold that sank past the flesh and settled deep into the marrow. Across from her sat the human. His name was Cole. When command had informed her that a Terran detachment was sending an advisor to bolster their defensive line, she had laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, just a tired one. She had heard the myths, of course. Everyone in the outer systems had. Cadets traded stories about humans in the academy, whispered tales of a species that could sprint for days without rest, that could survive vacuum exposure, that fought with the mindless, singular focus of a starving predator. They were the galaxy's bogeymen, a terrifying myth meant to keep aggressive empires in check. Looking at Cole, the commander felt nothing but profound disappointment. He was entirely unremarkable. He didn't look like a god of war. He looked like a mechanic who hadn't slept in a week. His uniform was stained with engine grease and dried mud. He was relatively short, lacking the dense, crystalline bone structure of her people. His skin was a pale, fragile-looking pinkish beige, dusted with dark stubble across his jaw. Right now, the legendary warrior of Earth was using a bent combat knife to scrape dirt out from under his fingernails. "You're breathing too fast, Commander," Cole said. He didn't look up. His voice was flat, gravelly, lacking the melodic resonance she was accustomed to. "I am breathing at the optimal rate to oxygenate my blood in a low ventilation environment," she replied, her tone sharper than intended. Cole finally looked up. His eyes were a washed-out blue. They looked dull. "Right. Well, it's loud. You're broadcasting your anxiety to the whole room." A flush of heat rose to her cheeks, turning the edges of her scales a deeper violet. He wasn't wrong. The 3 other soldiers in her squad, Ellis, Leon, and Faye, were huddled near the jammed blast door, their weapons resting limply in their laps. They looked at her, then quickly looked away. She was their commander. She was supposed to be the anchor. But every time the artillery shells slammed into the surface 300 feet above them, sending powdery dust raining down from the ceiling, her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The harrowers were up there. They were an invasive swarm fleet, towering bipeds wrapped in bioarmor thicker than starship plating. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. They dropped from orbit, reduced cities to slag, and harvested whatever organic material was left over. Her squad was the rear guard, ordered to hold the orbital defense gun above them for as long as possible while the civilian transports evacuated. "We are cut off," the commander said, leaning her head back against the wet concrete. "The comms array is dead. The atmospheric scrubbers are failing. If the harrowers don't dig down to us, we will suffocate in 72 hours. "We won't suffocate," Cole said. He wiped the blade of his knife on his pants and slid it into a sheath on his chest rig. "Oh, you have a plan to fix the scrubbers?" "No," he said, pulling a crushed ration bar from a pocket. He tore the wrapper open with his teeth. "I'm saying they're going to breach that door in about 10 minutes. Silence fell over the bunker. Even the distant, muffled thuds of the artillery seemed to pause. Ellis swallowed hard, the sound loud in the enclosed space. Faye tightened her grip on her plasma rifle. "How do you know that?" the commander asked, keeping her voice low. Cole chewed. He swallowed heavily, making a face. "Because the shelling stopped right above us about 2 minutes ago. They aren't trying to collapse the tunnel anymore. They're clearing the rubble. I can hear the microseismics." She pressed her hand to the ground. Nothing. She closed her eyes, tuning out the hum of the dying generator. Then she felt it, a rhythmic, heavy vibration. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't machinery, it was footsteps. Heavy, synchronized footsteps moving through the upper tunnels. "Defensive positions!" she barked, her voice cracking slightly. Ellis, Leon, and Faye scrambled into place behind a makeshift barricade of overturned metal crates and broken terminal stations. She drew her sidearm, checking the charge pack for the fourth time in an hour. Her hands were shaking. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop the tremors. The adrenaline felt like a poison in her veins, making her dizzy and weak. She glanced at Cole. He hadn't moved. He took another bite of his ration bar, chewing methodically. "Are you not going to fight?" she hissed, disgusted by his apathy. Cole finished his bite. He washed it down with a swig from a battered metal canteen. He screwed the cap back on, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and slowly stood up. He picked up his weapon, a kinetic projectile rifle. It was a primitive, brutal thing, heavy and scarred. No elegant plasma coils, just a metal tube designed to throw lead via chemical explosions. "I'm going to fight," Cole said quietly. He walked over to the barricade and stood beside her. Up close, she could smell him. It wasn't the sterile, metallic scent of her people. It was a dense, organic smell. Old sweat, leather, and something sharp and acrid that she couldn't quite identify. He reached out and placed a hand on her armored shoulder. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Don't empty your weapon on the first one," he said, his dull blue eyes suddenly sharp, locking onto hers. "They're big, but they bottleneck at the door. Aim for the joints, knees, neck. If they get close, don't try to grapple. Just shoot and move back." Before she could respond, the heavy steel of the blast door groaned. The metal buckled inward, a jagged V-shape forming in the center. The myths were about to meet reality. And looking at the tired, dirty man beside her, the commander was absolutely certain they were all going to die. The sound of the door giving way was less of a crash and more of a localized earthquake. The heavy retaining bolts, each thick as a leg, sheared off with a noise like a screaming animal. The massive steel plate blew inward, carried by a shockwave of overpressure and blinding white dust. The commander was thrown backward, the breath blasted from her lungs. Her shoulder struck the concrete wall, and for a terrifying, elongated second, the universe went silent. Her vision swam. Gray dust choked the air, thick and suffocating. It smelled of sulfur, burnt ozone, and the alkaline sting of pulverized rock. The bunker's main lights died. A second later, the emergency backups flickered on, bathing the room in a sickly, strobing crimson glow. "Get up," her brain screamed. "Get up!" Her body refused. The wind had been knocked out of her so violently that her diaphragm was locked. She lay on the floor, gasping like a stranded fish, staring at the gaping black hole where the door had been. Through the dust, a shape emerged. It was a harrower shock trooper. It had to duck to fit through the ruined doorway. Towering nearly 8 feet tall, its body was a nightmare of bioengineered armor, thick, chitinous plates the color of dried blood, overlapping over massive, corded muscles. It had no eyes, just a smooth, domed, sensory carapace, and a lower jaw that split into mandibles. It carried a heavy thermal lance, the weapon glowing with a menacing, white-hot heat. Faye was the first to fire. A streak of blue plasma erupted from her rifle, striking the harrower squarely in the chest. The creature didn't even flinch. The plasma splashed against its armor, leaving a scorched, glowing divot, but failing to penetrate. The harrower turned its domed head toward her. It raised the thermal lance. "Move!" Ellis yelled, diving to push Faye out of the way. He was too slow. The lance fired. It wasn't a projectile. It was a continuous, roaring beam of superheated energy. The sound it made was a horrific, deep-bass thrum that vibrated in their teeth. The beam caught Ellis mid-dive. There was no blood. The heat instantly cauterized the wound, turning the left side of his torso into a blackened, smoking ruin. He hit the ground, dead before his face smashed into the concrete. Faye screamed, a high, desperate sound, and held down the trigger of her rifle, spraying plasma wildly into the dark corridor. The sheer terror of the moment paralyzed the commander. Her combat training, years of tactical simulations, it all evaporated. This wasn't a sterile war game. This was a slaughter. The metallic tang of fear flooded her mouth. She managed to push herself up on one elbow, her hand scrabbling uselessly for her dropped sidearm. Two more harrowers stepped through the breach. The bunker was instantly too small. The heat radiating from their weapons made the air shimmer. Then the air split open. Crack, 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 crack. The sound was deafening. It wasn't the high-pitched hiss of plasma. It was the concussive, brutal roar of kinetic fire. Cole was standing completely out of cover. He had the stock of his rifle tucked tight against his shoulder. He wasn't spraying wildly. He was firing in controlled, rhythmic bursts. The first burst hit the lead harrower in the knee joint. The thick chitin shattered, a spray of dark, viscous fluid erupting into the red light. The massive creature roared a sound like grinding metal and buckled, dropping to one knee. Cole didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, not away from the monsters, toward them. Crack, crack. Two rounds punched through the flexible membrane beneath the creature's domed head. The back of the harrower's skull blew out in a shower of gore. It collapsed, twitching heavily. The second and third harrowers charged. They moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance in massive, thundering strides. One swung its thermal lance like a club, aiming for Cole's head. The commander expected him to perform some acrobatic dodge, some graceful martial arts maneuver they taught in the vids. He didn't. He just dropped his center of gravity and threw himself backward, letting the glowing weapon pass inches over his face. He hit the ground hard, rolled backward over his shoulder with the momentum, and came up on one knee. His rifle barked again. He emptied the magazine into the center mass of the second harrower. The heavy, armor-piercing slugs chewed through the chitin, tearing chunks of bioarmor away, but the creature didn't fall. It staggered, bleeding heavily, but lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of Cole's rifle. Cole didn't try to pull it back. He let go. As the harrower yanked the weapon away, stumbling slightly off balance from the sudden lack of resistance, Cole drew his sidearm. It was a heavy, blocky pistol. He jammed the barrel directly into the creature's chest, right where the armor had been blown away, and pulled the trigger 3 times. The concussive force in such close proximity turned the harrower's internal organs to paste. It fell forward, crashing onto the floor. 2 dead, in less than 10 seconds. But the third one was already there. It didn't use its weapon. It simply backhanded Cole with a massive clawed gauntlet. The impact lifted the human off his feet. The sickening crunch of bone breaking echoed over the noise of the generator. Cole flew through the air and slammed into the far wall, crumpling into a motionless heap of limbs. Faye and Leon finally recovered their wits. They opened fire on the remaining harrower, their plasma bolts searing its armor, forcing it to raise its arms to shield its sensory dome. The commander finally found her pistol. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely flick off the safety. She aimed at the beast, trying to find a weak point through the red emergency lights and the choking dust. Out of the corner of her eye, movement caught her attention. In the dust and shadows near the wall, Cole was moving. She stared, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard the sound of the strike. The kinetic force of a harrower's blow was enough to crush a reinforced transport chassis. Cole's rib cage should have been powder. His internal organs should have been ruptured. By all known biological metrics of her people, he should be an irreversible systemic shock. He wasn't. He was pushing himself up. It wasn't a smooth motion. It was ragged, jerky, and agonizing to watch. He spat a mouthful of dark crimson blood onto the floor. He planted one boot on the ground, then the other, and leaned heavily against the wall. His left arm hung completely useless at his side, the shoulder visibly dislocated. the bone tenting the fabric of his uniform. He didn't scream. He didn't call for a medic. He reached down with his good hand, unclipped the empty magazine from his pistol, let it drop, and slapped a fresh one home. He racked the slide using his belt. She looked at his face. The dull, tired mechanic was gone. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated so heavily they looked completely black in the red light. The veins in his neck were thick and bulging. His lips were pulled back in a grimace that bared blood-stained teeth. It wasn't a look of heroism. It wasn't bravery. It was pure, unadulterated, biological fury. He looked at the harrower pinning down Faye and Leon, and then the human let out a breath that sounded remarkably like a laugh, pushed off the wall, and walked back into the slaughter. The third harrower had cornered Leon. The young soldier was backing away, his plasma rifle overheated and venting steam, totally useless. The towering alien raised its thermal lance, preparing to skewer him against the bulkhead. Cole didn't shout a warning. He didn't announce his presence. He simply closed the distance with a heavy, uneven sprint, favoring his right leg. He hit the harrower from behind, using his own body weight as a projectile. The collision was messy. Cole slammed his good shoulder into the back of the creature's knee joint. The harrower buckled, its mass shifting backward, throwing its strike off course. The glowing lance plunged into the concrete wall, showering sparks and molten slag over the room. The alien roared, turning its massive bulk to deal with the nuisance. It swung a heavy arm downward, trying to crush Cole like an insect. Cole rolled underneath the arc of the blow. The movement was ugly, frantic, driven by pure survival instinct. As the creature's arm smashed into the floor, shattering the synthcrete, Cole scrambled up the alien's side. He grabbed the overlapping plates of its bioarmor with his one good hand, hauling himself upward. It was madness. The commander species fought from a distance, calculating angles, waiting for perfectly aligned tactical advantages. They didn't grapple with monsters. They didn't throw their soft, fragile bodies against armor plating. But Cole wasn't fighting like a soldier anymore. He was fighting like an animal. The harrower thrashed, trying to dislodge him. Cole held on with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He swung his heavy pistol like a hammer, smashing the steel grip repeatedly into the soft, flexible joint behind the creature's neck. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was wet and sickening. The harrower shrieked, reaching up to claw at its own back. One of its massive, scythe-like fingers caught Cole in the side. The commander watched the sharp tip tear through his uniform, slicing deep into his torso. A bright spray of crimson hit the wall, human blood. Cole grunted a harsh, guttural sound of air leaving his lungs, but he didn't let go. If anything, the injury seemed to make him faster. His body was dumping astronomical levels of adrenaline, overriding the pain receptors, flooding his nervous system with the chemical imperative to kill. He wedged the barrel of his pistol into the bleeding gap he had just smashed open in the alien's neck. He pulled the trigger until the slide locked back empty. Muffled explosions thumped deep inside the harrower's upper thorax. The creature stiffened violently, a horrific gargling sound erupting from its mandibles. It stood perfectly rigid for a second, then collapsed backward. Cole rode the massive corpse down, hitting the ground hard as the alien's weight settled. Silence descended on the bunker, broken only by the hiss of the dying thermal lance and the ragged, wet sound of Cole's breathing. The commander slowly pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling so badly she had to lean against the barricade. Leon was curled in a fetal position, staring blankly at the dead harrower. Faye was weeping silently, her hands pressed over her face. She looked at the human. Cole was sitting on the chest of the dead alien. His uniform was soaked in a mixture of dark alien fluids and his own bright red blood. He was clutching his torn side with his one functioning hand. His face was pale, a stark contrast to the smeared dirt and gore. The myth was dead. There was no poetry here, no grand symphony of violence, no elegant, invincible god of war. Just a fragile, squishy, bleeding man sitting in a pile of corpses. The commander stepped closer, her boots crunching on the broken concrete. The smell was overpowering now, the coppery reek of human blood mixed with the sulfurous stench of the harrowers. It turned her stomach, making bile rise in her throat. "You're bleeding," she said. It was a stupid, obvious thing to say, but her mind was struggling to process what she had just witnessed. Cole looked up at her. The feral light in his eyes was slowly fading, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He blinked, leaving a streak of blood across his eyelid. "Yeah," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He coughed, spitting more blood onto the alien's armor. "Hit an artery, I think. Feels warm." You should be dead," she stammered, the words spilling out without her consent. "The structural damage to your skeletal frame, the blood loss. Your nervous system should have shut down from the trauma." Cole let out a short, breathy chuckle that ended in a wince. He leaned his head back against the domed skull of the creature he had just butchered. "Humans?" he whispered, staring up at the cracked, dust-raining ceiling. "We don't shut down, Commander. We just run hot until the engine seizes." He closed his eyes. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead. She took a step forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. Then he opened his eyes again. They locked onto the ruined doorway. The dust was settling, but the corridor beyond was still dark. From the darkness, the heavy, rhythmic vibration returned. Thump, thump, thump. More footsteps. Many more. Cole let out a long, shuddering sigh. He looked at his ruined left arm, then at his bleeding side. He reached down to the chest rig of the dead harrower, pulling a heavy, serrated combat knife from its sheath. The weapon was meant for a hand 3 times the size of his own. He gripped the handle with his right hand, resting the heavy blade across his knee. "Commander," Cole said, his voice stripped of all emotion, reduced to a flat, mechanical deadness. "Yes," she whispered. "Find another gun." The first wave was just the scouts. She stood there, looking at this broken, bleeding creature. Her mind wrestled with an impossible contradiction. She was horrified by him. She was repulsed by the sheer, ugly savagery of what he was. But as the shadows in the corridor began to shift, and the guttural roars of a dozen more harrowers echoed down the tunnel, the commander realized something else. She had never been so glad to stand behind a human. The shadows in the corridor did not just shift, they solidified. The commander felt the approaching mass of the second wave in the marrow of her bones before she saw them. The floorboards, what was left of them beneath the cracked synthcrete, hummed with a sickening, rhythmic weight. The air pressure in the room dropped. The smell hit them first. A noxious wave of ammonia, rotting vegetation, and the superheated ozone of charging thermal lances. "Faye, Leon," she rasped. Her throat felt full of glass. "Form up on the barricade. Use the corpses to brace your weapons." They moved like automatons, their eyes wide and glassy, completely hollowed out by trauma. But they moved. They dragged themselves behind the overturned crates, resting the heavy barrels of their plasma rifles over the chitinous back of the harrower Cole had killed. She knelt beside the charred, smoking remains of Ellis. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't. She pried his plasma rifle from his stiffening fingers. The casing was slick with his blood, the polymer grip warm and tacky against her scales. She checked the charge. 60%. It would have to be enough. She looked at Cole. He hadn't moved from his spot on the floor. He sat with his back against the barricade, his ruined left arm resting in his lap, the massive alien combat knife gripped in his right hand. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged gasps. Every time he exhaled, a fine mist of blood sprayed from his lips. He was dying. It wasn't a tactical assessment, it was a biological certainty. His skin had taken on the color of wet ash. "Cole," she said, her voice barely audible over the approaching thunder. "Get behind us." He slowly turned his head. His blue eyes were completely blown out. the pupils swallowing the irises. He looked at her, but she wasn't entirely sure he saw her. He offered a slow, terrible smile. His teeth were entirely red. "Can't," he whispered, the word bubbling up through fluid in his lungs. "Legs gone, bones, poking through the calf." She stared at his right leg. He was right. Beneath the thick fabric of his trousers, a jagged white splinter of the tibia had pierced the skin, welling with dark blood. He had fought the last harrower on a shattered leg, driven entirely by the narcotic flood of his own violently dying nervous system. "Then just stay down," she said. "No." He shifted his grip on the massive, serrated knife. "They come through. They gotta step over me. I'll cut the tendons. Give you a clean shot." Before she could argue, the first harrower stepped into the breach. It was larger than the scouts, its carapace reinforced with heavy, overlapping plates of black biological armor. It roared, a sound that bypassed the eardrums and rattled directly against the spine. "Fire!" she screamed. The bunker erupted into blinding light. Faye, Leon, and the commander held their triggers down, flooding the doorway with a continuous, searing stream of blue plasma. The heat was instantaneous and suffocating. The air turned to fire. The lead harrower took the brunt of the volley. Plasma splashed against its black armor, bubbling and hissing, boiling the biochitin away in thick, foul-smelling clouds of black smoke. The creature shrieked, raising its massive arms to shield its sensory dome, but it didn't stop. It blindly pushed forward, driven by the sheer momentum of its colossal weight, acting as a meat shield for the harrowers pouring in behind it. It stumbled over the pile of corpses, its heavy cloven foot slamming onto the concrete inches from Cole. Cole moved. It was a jerky, disjointed spasm of violence. He drove the alien knife upward with his good arm, plunging the serrated blade deep into the unarmored joint behind the creature's ankle. He didn't just stab, he twisted his entire upper body, sawing violently against the thick, rubbery tendons. The harrower let out a deafening screech and collapsed forward, its leg giving out entirely. It crashed over the barricade, its massive bulk slamming into the floor right in front of the squad. "The head! Shoot the head!" the commander yelled, firing point blank into the creature's domed skull. Leon and Faye joined in, plasma bolts melting through the weakened armor until the creature's brain case popped with a wet, sickening detonation. But there was no time to breathe. Two more harrowers stepped over their fallen commander. The bunker became a slaughterhouse. There were no tactics left. There was no space. It was a suffocating, blinding crush of bodies, heat, and noise. A thermal lance swept across the room, vaporizing the remains of the communications terminal and showering the soldiers with molten slag. A glob of liquid metal hit Faye's shoulder. She screamed, dropping her rifle, batting frantically at the burning hole in her armor. The commander fired until her weapon overheated, the warning alarms blaring in her ears, the grip burning her palms. She dropped it and drew her pistol, firing blindly into the wall of shrieking, thrashing alien flesh pressing through the door. Below it all, buried in the dark, bloody mud of the floor, Cole fought. He was completely submerged in the crush of alien bodies. She caught glimpses of him through the strobing red lights and the blinding flashes of plasma. He was a nightmare of pure, feral endurance. A harrower stepped on his chest, and Cole simply drove his pistol into the bottom of its foot and pulled the trigger. Another reached down to crush his skull, and Cole caught the massive wrist with his one good hand, sinking his teeth, his actual, blunt, human teeth into the soft webbing between the creature's claws while frantically stabbing upward with the knife. He was a broken machine, leaking vital fluids, his structural integrity compromised, yet the engine refused to stop turning. A harrower lunged at the commander. Its mandibles snapped inches from her face, its foul breath washing over her. She jammed her pistol against its chest and pulled the trigger. Nothing. Empty. The creature raised a claw to decapitate her. She closed her eyes, bracing for the end. A deafening crack echoed through the bunker. The harrower's head snapped backward, showering her in dark, hot fluid. It collapsed, dead before it hit the floor. She opened her eyes. Cole was lying on his back, buried under the torso of a dead alien. He had managed to pry a kinetic rifle from the grip of a crushed human corpse earlier, and he was holding it awkwardly against his chest with his right arm. The barrel was smoking. He looked at her. His face was a mask of gore. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a thick torrent of blood spilled out. Suddenly, the ground shook violently. Not footsteps, an explosion, deep and resonant. The harrowers paused, their domed heads swiveling toward the ceiling. "Cole!" the commander screamed over the ringing in her ears. "What did you do?" He let his head fall back against the concrete. His chest heaved one final shuddering time. He raised a trembling, blood-soaked finger and pointed toward the doorway. She looked. Wedged between the crushed frame of the blast door and the overlapping armor plates of a dead harrower was a Terran high-yield demolition charge. Its timer, blinking a harsh, bright green in the darkness, hit 0. "Get down!" she roared, throwing herself over Faye and Leon. The world didn't just end, it dissolved. The explosion was a physical entity, a solid wall of force that sucked the oxygen from the room and shattered her eardrums. The ceiling above the corridor disintegrated. Millions of tons of compacted dirt, synthcrete, and bedrock came crashing down, obliterating the doorway, the second wave of harrowers, and the entire tunnel network beyond. A thick, suffocating wave of dust rolled over them, completely blacking out the room. Then, there was nothing but silence. The commander didn't know how long she lay there in the dark. Time had lost its meaning, measured only by the rhythmic throbbing agony in her head and the metallic taste of dust on her tongue. Slowly, the emergency backups kicked in again, casting a dim, flickering amber light over the tomb. The bunker was unrecognizable. The doorway was entirely gone, replaced by a solid wall of collapsed earth and jagged concrete rebar. The air was thick, nearly unbreathable, heavy with the stench of explosive residue, charred meat, and raw dirt. "Faye? Leon?" she coughed, pushing herself up onto her hands and knees. "Here," Leon whimpered from the dark. He was sitting against the far wall, cradling Faye in his lap. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, the burn on her shoulder an ugly, blackened crater. But she was alive. The commander dragged herself across the floor, her limbs feeling like lead. She crawled over the mountains of alien corpses, her hands slipping in pools of viscous fluid. She found Cole near the collapsed wall. He was partially buried under the rubble, pinned beneath the massive severed arm of a harrower. His kinetic rifle lay broken in half beside him. She knelt beside him, frantically using her hands to dig the heavy rocks away from his chest. "Cole! Cole! Look at me!" He didn't move. His eyes were closed. His face was completely drained of color, his skin resembling old, dry parchment. The feral, terrifying monster that had ripped aliens apart with his teeth was gone. He looked incredibly small. He looked fragile. She pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for the pulse point she had studied in the Academy's xenobiology manual. It was there, weak, erratic, a fluttering moth against the skin, but it was there. "Cole," she said again, her voice cracking. She wiped the dirt and blood from his forehead. It felt incredibly cold. His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, agonizingly, they parted. The washed-out blue eyes were unfocused, staring blindly at the cracked ceiling. "Commander," he breathed. The word was barely a vibration in the air. "I am here. You did it. The tunnel is collapsed. They cannot get through." She fumbled with her medical pouch, her hands shaking violently as she pulled out a vial of coagulant foam. "I am going to seal your wounds. You just have to hold on." Cole slowly moved his right hand, weakly batting the vial away. "Don't waste it." "It is not a waste, you insufferable primate!" she yelled, a sudden, desperate anger flaring in her chest. "You are not dying here. That is an order, A faint, trembling smile touched the corners of his mouth. Orders don't mean much to a busted engine, sir. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made her own chest ache. He swallowed hard. Is it cold? He whispered. Feels really cold. The atmospheric scrubbers are dead, she lied, knowing full well the cold he felt was his own blood retreating from his extremities, his body shutting down its peripheral systems to keep his heart beating for just a few more seconds. We will get you a thermal blanket. We just have to wait for extraction. Extraction, he murmured. His eyes drifted away from her, staring into the middle distance. Never liked the quiet. Too loud. The commander sat back on her heels. She looked at the devastation around them. At the mounds of bio-armored giants, creatures bred for flawless, efficient slaughter, now reduced to butchered meat on the floor. And then she looked back at the frail, pale creature who had put them there. They told us stories about your kind in the academy, she said quietly, the words spilling out into the dark. They said humans were born with iron in their blood, that you felt no pain, that you were machines of war. Cole's chest shuddered as he took a shallow breath. Propaganda, he rasped. I know, she said, looking at his shattered leg, his dislocated arm, the deep, lethal gouges in his side. I see that now. Cole rolled his head slightly, his dull blue eyes finally locking onto hers. There was no fire left in them, just a profound, overwhelming exhaustion. We feel it, Cole whispered, his voice cracking. We feel all of it. Every broken bone. Every cut. Then how? She asked, leaning closer, desperate to understand the impossible contradiction of his existence. How did you keep fighting? Your body was destroyed. You should have stopped. Cole smiled again. It was a sad, gentle expression, completely devoid of the savagery she had witnessed earlier. Because he breathed, the light in his eyes beginning to dim. If we stop, the people behind us have to feel it instead. He closed his eyes. Cole? She whispered. He didn't answer. His chest stopped moving. The bunker grew utterly, terrifyingly silent. The engine had finally seized. The commander sat there in the dirt, her hands resting in the human's blood. She didn't weep. Her species did not produce tears, but a hollow, agonizing weight settled in the center of her chest, a profound ache that she had never experienced in her long military career. She had laughed at the myths. She had thought them exaggerations, fairy tales designed to frighten cadets. She was wrong. The myths didn't do them justice. They weren't invincible gods. They weren't monsters of iron and fire. They were soft, squishy, fragile things that bled and broke and died, just like the rest of the galaxy's species. But what the galaxy didn't understand, what the harrowers had learned too late, was the terrifying, unfathomable depth of a human's spite. Their strength wasn't in their muscles or their bones. It was in their absolute pathological refusal to die before the job was done. 3 hours later, the heavy grinding of industrial drills echoed from the ceiling. The orbital gun above them had held. The civilian transports had escaped. The planetary defense forces were digging them out. When the rescue team finally broke through the rock and lowered themselves into the bunker, they found Faye and Leon shivering in the corner. And they found the commander, sitting cross-legged in the center of the slaughterhouse, resting her hand on the shoulder of a dead mechanic from Earth. A medic rushed toward her, his scanner sweeping over her battered armor. "Commander, are you injured? What happened here?" She looked up at the medic, then down at Cole. She looked at the mountain of alien corpses that he had built with a broken knife and a shattered body. "Nothing," she said quietly, her voice raw and hollow. "Just a man. Being human." Thanks for joining us for this journey into the dark, relentless heart of humanity. If this story of survival, grit, and the unyielding human spirit kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY Sci-Fi original. Have your own thoughts on the human myth? Drop a comment below, and please share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans. Stay strong out there.